Sometimes salvation comes in the form of calloused hands and a gentle voice. At 26, Emma Wright had learned that survival meant running, hiding, and trusting no one. But when exhaustion and hunger finally brought her to her knees on a remote mountain trail, she never expected the bearded stranger who found her to offer something she'd forgotten existed: safety. Thomas Mitchell was known throughout Pine Ridge Valley as the mountain man who preferred solitude to society, cattle to conversation. Yet when he discovered a half-starved woman collapsed near his property line, something stirred in his weathered heart that he hadn't felt since the war ended. His offer was simple and shocking: work in his fields, sleep under his protection, and never fear another hungry night. But Emma Wright carried secrets that could destroy them both, and in 1885 Colorado Territory, a woman alone with a man meant scandal or salvation depending on who was telling the tale. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The October sun cast long shadows across the Colorado mountainside as Emma Wright stumbled through another day of walking, her worn boots barely holding together after 3 weeks of hard travel. The weight of her small bundle had grown impossibly heavy, though it contained little more than a change of clothes and the last of her mother's jewelry, traded piece by piece for scraps of food along the way. Her stomach had stopped growling days ago, settling into a hollow ache that made each step a deliberation between forward motion and collapse. She'd been running since the morning she'd overheard her stepfather negotiating her marriage to Vernon Blackwood, a man whose reputation for cruelty toward women was whispered about in parlors throughout Denver. The bruises on her stepfather's new wife told Emma everything she needed to know about what happened to women who disappointed the men in her family. So she'd taken what little money she could find, packed her few belongings, and disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving behind the only life she'd ever known. 3 weeks of walking mountain trails and sleeping in abandoned cabins had brought her to Pine Ridge Valley, though she hadn't known its name when she'd first glimpsed the settlement nestled between towering peaks. The town of Copper Falls looked peaceful enough from a distance, smoke rising from chimneys and the distant sound of hammers suggesting honest work and prosperity. But Emma had learned to be wary of peaceful appearances, and she decided to skirt the town rather than risk questions about a woman traveling alone. The decision had nearly cost her life. The mountain trail she'd chosen was longer and more treacherous than anticipated, and her meager supplies had run out 2 days earlier. Now, as the afternoon light began to fade and the mountain air grew crisp with the promise of an early frost, Emma felt her strength finally failing. Her legs trembled with each step, and dark spots danced at the edges of her vision, warning signs she'd learned to recognize during the lean years after her mother's death. She was following what appeared to be a creek bed, hoping it might lead to a farmhouse or at least a place where she could find water, when her foot caught on a hidden root. The fall seemed to happen slowly, her weakened body unable to catch itself as she tumbled forward onto the rocky ground. Pain shot through her knee and palms, but it was the wave of dizziness that followed that truly frightened her. She tried to push herself up, but her arms wouldn't support her weight, and she sank back down with a gasp of frustration and despair. This is how it ends, she thought, lying on the cold ground as the shadows lengthened around her. Not from violence or cruelty, but from simple exhaustion and the brutal mathematics of survival. She closed her eyes and tried to summon the energy to stand, to keep walking, to refuse defeat for at least another few hours. But her body had made the decision for her, shutting down non-essential functions to preserve what little life remained. The sound of approaching hoofbeats barely registered in her consciousness. Emma had heard horses throughout her journey, but they always belonged to travelers with their own destinations, their own purposes that didn't include rescuing foolish women who'd bitten off more than they could chew. She kept her eyes closed and tried to make herself as small as possible, hoping whoever it was would pass by without noticing her crumpled form among the rocks and fallen leaves. The hoofbeats stopped. Well, now, came a deep voice, rough with disuse but surprisingly gentle. That doesn't look comfortable. Emma forced her eyes open and found herself looking up at a man on horseback, silhouetted against the afternoon sky. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled beneath a worn hat and a beard that spoke of months spent away from civilization. His clothes were practical rather than fashionable, work pants and a heavy shirt that had seen honest labor, and his boots were scuffed from walking through brush and over rocks. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, pale blue and serious, studying her with the kind of careful assessment that suggested he was accustomed to making quick decisions about people and situations. "I'm fine," Emma managed to say, though the words came out as barely more than a whisper. "Just resting." The man dismounted with fluid grace, his movements economical and purposeful. Up close, Emma could see that he was older than she'd first thought, probably in his 30s, with lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into bright sun and harsh weather. There was something about his bearing that suggested military training, a way of holding himself that spoke of discipline and command. "Ma'am, with respect, you don't look fine," he said, crouching down beside her but maintaining a careful distance. "You look like someone who hasn't eaten in a while, and has been walking farther than feet were meant to walk. When's the last time you had a proper meal?" Emma tried to remember, but the days had blurred together into a haze of hunger and determination. "Yesterday," she lied, unwilling to admit that it had been 3 days since she'd managed to buy a small loaf of bread from a farmer's wife. The man's expression suggested he didn't believe her, but he didn't challenge the lie directly. Instead, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a piece of wrapped cloth. "I've got some jerky here and a canteen of water. Not much, but it might help you get your strength back." Emma stared at the offered food, her mouth watering at the thought of actual sustenance, but years of caution held her back. "I don't have money to pay you. Didn't ask for any," the man replied simply. "Sometimes folks need help, and sometimes other folks are in a position to provide it. This seems like one of those times." There was something in his tone, matter of fact and without expectation, that convinced Emma to accept his offering. She took the jerky with shaking hands and bit into it, the salt and protein hitting her system like a shock of. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Of electricity. The water that followed was clear and cold, tasting of mountain springs and possibility. "Thank you," she said when she'd managed to consume half of what he'd given her. "I'm Emma Wright, Thomas Mitchell," he replied, settling back on his heels. "Most folks call me Tom. I've got a place about a mile up the trail, if you're looking for somewhere to rest properly." Emma's survival instincts, honed by weeks of vigilance, immediately raised alarms. A strange man offering shelter to a vulnerable woman could mean any number of unpleasant outcomes. But as she studied Tom Mitchell's face, she saw none of the calculating looks she'd learned to fear from men like Vernon Blackwood. Instead, she saw genuine concern and what appeared to be an honest desire to help. "I don't want to impose," she said carefully. "No imposition," Tom replied. "I've got more space than I know what to do with, and it's getting cold enough at night that sleeping outdoors isn't advisable for someone in your condition." Emma looked up at the sky, noting how the light was fading and feeling the chill that was already settling into the mountain air. She had no tent, no warm blankets, and barely enough energy to gather firewood even if she could find a suitable place to camp. The practical part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive for 3 weeks of difficult travel, pointed out that she had little choice but to trust this stranger. "Your condition," she repeated. "What exactly do you think my condition is?" Tom's expression grew more serious. "I think you're a woman alone who's been traveling hard with insufficient supplies. I think you're probably running from something or someone, and I think you're about one cold night away from serious trouble. Am I wrong about any of that?" Emma considered lying, maintaining the fiction that she was simply a traveler who'd underestimated the difficulty of mountain travel. But the jerky was already working its magic, clearing her head enough to think beyond the immediate need for survival, and she found herself appreciating Tom Mitchell's directness. "No," she said quietly. "You're not wrong about any of it." Tom nodded as if this was exactly the answer he'd expected. "Well then, the way I see it, you've got 2 choices. You can accept help from someone who's offering it freely, or you can try to make it through another night on your own, and hope for the best. But Emma Wright, I have to tell you honestly, that I don't think you've got another night in you." The blunt assessment stung because it was accurate. Emma had been pushing herself beyond her limits for days, running on determination and desperation, rather than actual strength. The food Tom had given her was helping, but it would take more than a piece of jerky to restore what weeks of inadequate nutrition had depleted. If I come with you, she said slowly, what exactly are you offering? A roof over your head, a hot meal, and a chance to rest until you figure out what comes next. Tom replied, I've got a cabin with a spare room, plenty of food, and no expectations beyond basic human decency. Emma studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda. She'd become adept at reading men's intentions during her weeks of travel, learning to spot the ones who saw a woman alone as an opportunity for exploitation. But Tom Mitchell's expression remained steady and open, his pale blue eyes meeting hers without flinching or calculation. Why? She asked. Why would you help a complete stranger? Tom was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the mountains that surrounded them. I suppose because someone helped me once when I needed it. Seemed only right to pass it along. There was something in his tone that suggested a story behind those simple words. But Emma didn't press for details. She had her own secrets, after all, and she understood the value of privacy. All right, she said finally. I accept your offer. But I want to work for my keep. I'm not looking for charity. A ghost of a smile crossed Tom's face. I've got fields that need harvesting, and a house that could use a woman's touch. If you're willing to work, there's plenty that needs doing. Tom helped her to her feet, his hands steady and strong as she fought another wave of dizziness. Her legs felt like water, but the food and water were already beginning to restore some stability to her system. He led his horse while she walked beside him, moving slowly enough to accommodate her weakened condition. The trail wound upward through stands of pine and aspen, the trees brilliant with autumn colors that Emma might have appreciated under different circumstances. As they walked, Tom pointed out landmarks, the creek that provided water for his property, the meadow where he grazed his cattle, the stands of timber he'd been selectively harvesting to supplement his income from farming. How long have you lived here? Emma asked, partly from curiosity, and partly to keep herself focused on something other than the effort of putting one foot in front of the other. About 5 years, Tom replied. Bought the land with my army pay after the war ended. Seemed like a good place to build something lasting. Emma noticed that he didn't specify which war, though given his age, it was probably the recent conflict between the states. Many men had come west afterward, seeking new starts in territories that didn't hold memories of battlefields and lost friends. Do you farm the land alone, mostly? I hire help during planting and harvest, and I've got arrangements with some of the neighbors for shared labor when needed. But day to day, it's just me and the livestock. Emma tried to imagine what it would be like to live in such isolation, surrounded by mountains and responsible for every aspect of survival. It sounded both terrifying and appealingly peaceful, especially compared to the complicated social dynamics of Denver society that she'd fled. Here we are, Tom said as they rounded a bend in the trail. Emma looked up and felt her breath catch in her throat. The cabin that came into view was larger than she'd expected, built of logs that had weathered to a warm golden brown. It sat in a clearing that had been carved from the forest, with fields stretching out beyond it toward the mountains. Gardens filled with late-season vegetables surrounded the house, and she could see a barn and other outbuildings that spoke of a working farm, rather than a simple homestead. Smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting that Tom had banked the fire before leaving, and warm light glowed in the windows as the evening shadows deepened. It was the kind of home Emma had dreamed of during her childhood, when her mother would tell stories about places where people could live peacefully without fear or want. It's beautiful, she said softly. It's home, Tom replied simply. Come on, let's get you inside before you fall over. The interior of the cabin was as impressive as the exterior had promised. The main room featured a large stone fireplace with a fire crackling cheerfully, surrounded by handmade furniture that spoke of skill and patience. The kitchen area was well equipped with modern conveniences, including a cast iron stove and a hand pump that brought water directly into the house. Everything was clean and well maintained, though Emma could see the telltale signs of a bachelor household in the sparse decorations and purely functional arrangements. The spare room is through there, Tom said, nodding toward a doorway off the main room. It's got a good bed and a washstand, and there's a lock on the door if that makes you feel more comfortable. Emma appreciated both the offer of privacy and Tom's acknowledgement that a woman alone might need reassurance about her safety. "Thank you. That's very thoughtful." Tom moved to the stove and began pulling ingredients from various cupboards and shelves. "I'll get some food started. Nothing fancy, but it'll be hot and filling. Why don't you get settled, and we can eat when you're ready?" Emma made her way to the spare room, finding it exactly as Tom had described. The bed was covered with a handmade quilt in shades of blue and green, and the washstand held a pitcher of water and a clean towel. A small window looked out toward the fields, and Emma could see the last light of day painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. She sank down on the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself to believe that she was safe, at least for the moment. The room smelled of pine and fresh air, and the silence was broken only by the distant sound of Tom moving around the kitchen and the crackling of the fire in the main room. For the first time in weeks, Emma allowed herself to think beyond immediate survival. She was still a long way from any kind of permanent solution to her problems, but Tom Mitchell's unexpected kindness had bought her time to rest and plan. She had no idea what she would do next, but at least she would face those decisions with a full stomach and a clear head. The smell of cooking food drew her back to the main room, where Tom was stirring something in a large pot on the stove. He'd removed his hat, revealing dark hair that was slightly longer than fashionable, and he'd rolled up his sleeves to expose forearms marked with old scars that could have come from farm work or military service. "Smells wonderful," Emma said. "Beef stew," Tom replied. "I made a big pot yesterday, so it just needed heating. There's fresh bread too, if you're interested." Emma's stomach responded to the mention of fresh bread with an audible growl that made her blush. Tom pretended not to notice as he ladled stew into bowls and cut thick slices from a loaf that looked like it had come from a professional bakery. They ate in comfortable silence, Emma focusing on consuming as much food as her stomach could handle without making herself sick, while Tom seemed content to watch her eat with satisfaction. The stew was rich and flavorful, with tender chunks of beef and vegetables that had been grown in his own garden, and the bread was the best Emma had tasted since leaving Denver. "This is incredible," she said when she'd managed to finish most of her bowl. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "Army taught me the basics, and I've had 5 years to practice," Tom replied. "A man gets tired of burned beans and tough meat pretty quickly when he's cooking for himself every day." Emma could see that Tom Mitchell was a man who approached everything with the same methodical competence, from farming to cooking to offering aid to stranded travelers. There was something deeply reassuring about being in the presence of someone so capable and self-sufficient. "Tell me about the work you mentioned," she said. "What exactly needs doing?" Tom leaned back in his chair, considering her question. "Well, there's the late harvest to finish. Potatoes and squash mostly, some of the root vegetables that can handle the cold. The apple trees need picking, and I've got plans to put up preserves for winter. Then there's the general maintenance that comes with running a place like this, mending and cleaning and organizing." Emma nodded, mentally cataloging the tasks and feeling a spark of anticipation. She'd grown up helping her mother with similar work, and the prospect of honest labor in beautiful surroundings was appealing after weeks of uncertainty and fear. "I can do all of that," she said. "I'm not afraid of hard work." "I didn't think you were," Tom replied. "A woman who walks 3 weeks through mountain country isn't likely to be scared of getting her hands dirty." Emma looked up at him, surprised by his matter-of-fact assessment. "How did you know how long I've been traveling?" Tom's expression grew more serious. "Your boots are worn through in patterns that suggest long-distance walking on rough terrain. Your clothes are clean but showing wear consistent with weeks of hard use. You've got the kind of tan that comes from spending days in the sun, and your hands show recent calluses from carrying a pack over long distances." He paused, studying her face. "Plus you've got the look of someone who's been living on determination rather than adequate food for quite a while." Emma stared at him, unsettled by how much he'd been able to deduce from simple observation. "You notice a lot." "Army habit," Tom said simply. "Learning to read situations and people quickly can be the difference between living and dying." Emma filed this information away, adding it to what she was learning about Thomas Mitchell. He was clearly more than just a mountain farmer, and his military background explained both his self-sufficiency and his ability to make quick, accurate assessments of people and situations. "What about you?" Tom asked. "What brings a well-educated woman with good clothes and city manners to a mountain trail in the middle of nowhere?" Emma had been expecting this question, but she still wasn't sure how much of the truth she was prepared to share. Tom had been generous and kind, but she barely knew him, and her situation was complicated enough that the full story might put both of them in danger. "I needed to leave Denver quickly," she said carefully. "There were circumstances that made staying impossible." Tom nodded, as if this explanation was sufficient. "Fair enough. Everyone's got a right to privacy about their past." Emma felt a wave of gratitude for his restraint. Many men would have pressed for details, especially given that she was now depending on his hospitality. The fact that Tom respected her privacy without question made her trust him a little more. "I should probably get some rest," she said, suddenly feeling the weight of exhaustion settling over her now that her immediate needs had been met. "Good idea," Tom agreed. "We can talk more about work arrangements in the morning, when you've had a chance to recover your strength." Emma stood to leave, then paused at the doorway to the spare room. "Tom, thank you for everything. I know you didn't have to help me." Tom looked up from where he was banking the fire for the night. "Emma, tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it, I'll show you around the property. Help you get oriented before we start talking about work." Emma nodded and made her way to the spare room, closing the door behind her and turning the lock with a sense of relief. She undressed quickly and slipped between sheets that smelled of sunshine and fresh air, probably dried on the line outside. The bed was more comfortable than anything she'd experienced in weeks, and the sound of wind in the pines outside the window was soothing rather than threatening. As she drifted off to sleep, Emma found herself thinking about Tom Mitchell's offer. Work in his fields, sleep under his protection, and never fear another hungry night. It sounded almost too good to be true, but the evidence of his character suggested that he was a man who meant what he said. For the first time since fleeing Denver, Emma allowed herself to hope that she might have found not just temporary shelter but a chance to build something better than the life she'd left behind. The mountain man who'd found her, collapsed on his trail, had offered her more than food and shelter. He'd offered her the possibility of belonging somewhere again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, but tonight, Emma Wright was safe, fed, and warm. It was more than she'd dared to hope for when she'd started this journey, and it was enough to let her sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks. Emma woke to the sound of an axe splitting wood, the rhythmic thunk echoing across the valley in the crisp morning air. Sunlight streamed through the small window of her room, and for a moment she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back, and she sat up in bed, marveling at how rested she felt after one night of proper sleep and adequate food. The wooden floor was cold beneath her bare feet as she moved to the window and looked out across Tom's property. In the early morning light, she could see the full scope of what he'd built here. Fields stretched toward the mountains, some already harvested, and others still heavy with crops waiting to be gathered. Cattle grazed in pastures enclosed by split-rail fences, and she could see Tom himself working near the woodpile, his movements efficient and powerful as he reduced logs to manageable pieces for the winter ahead. Emma dressed quickly in her cleanest clothes, acutely aware that her traveling outfit was hardly appropriate for farm work. She would need to find a way to acquire more practical clothing if she was going to stay here long enough to help with the harvest. The thought surprised her with its assumption of permanence, but she pushed aside her doubts and focused on the immediate task of presenting herself as a useful addition to Tom's household. When she emerged from her room, she found coffee already brewing on the stove and a plate of eggs and bacon keeping warm in the oven. A note written in Tom's careful script lay beside the plate, explaining that he'd started work early but would return shortly to show her around the property. Emma ate gratefully, appreciating both the food and Tom's thoughtfulness in providing it without making her feel like a burden. She was washing her dishes when Tom appeared in the doorway, his shirt damp with sweat despite the cool morning air. He'd removed his hat, and his dark hair was tallowed from physical exertion, giving him a younger appearance than she'd noticed the night before. "Good morning," he said, moving to the sink to wash his hands. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in weeks," Emma admitted. "Thank you for the breakfast. You didn't need to go to that trouble." "No trouble," Tom replied, drying his hands on a clean towel. "I'm used to cooking for one, but it's not much harder to cook for two." Emma noticed that Tom moved around his kitchen with the same methodical efficiency he brought to his outdoor work, everything organized and purposeful. There was something deeply appealing about his competence, the way he seemed to handle every aspect of his life with quiet confidence. "Are you ready for that tour?" he asked. "I'd like to show you what needs doing before we start making plans." Emma nodded eagerly, curious to see more of the property and understand what Tom expected of her. They stepped outside into air so clear and crisp it almost hurt to breathe, the mountains rising around them like protective walls. Emma had never lived anywhere so beautiful or so isolated, and she found herself both exhilarated and slightly intimidated by the vastness of the landscape. Tom led her first to the barn, a substantial structure that housed his draft horses, several milk cows, and an impressive collection of farm equipment. Everything was well maintained and organized, from the neat rows of tools hanging on the walls to the clean stalls that showed evidence of daily care. "I've got 6 horses," Tom explained, introducing her to each animal by name. "Buck and Belle are my primary work team, strong enough to pull the plow and the harvest wagon. Star and Comet are riding horses, and the 2 mares, Daisy and Rose, are bred for next spring." Emma listened carefully, filing away information about each animal's temperament and purpose. She'd grown up around horses, and she could see that Tom's animals were healthy and well cared for, their coats glossy, and their eyes bright with intelligence. "The cattle are pastured up the valley," Tom continued, leading her toward the fields. "About 30 head, mostly beef cattle with a few dairy cows for household use. They're hardy stock, bred to handle mountain winters and summer grazing on rough terrain." As they walked through the harvested fields, Tom explained his crop rotation system and pointed out the areas designated for different purposes. He'd planted potatoes, squash, beans and corn, along with hay fields to feed his livestock through the winter. A large vegetable garden near the house provided fresh produce, and fruit trees along the creek offered apples, pears, and cherries. "The harvest is running behind schedule," Tom admitted as they stopped beside a field heavy with unharvested potatoes. "I twisted my ankle last week and lost several days of work. Most of these crops need to come in before the first hard frost, which could happen any time now." Emma knelt down and examined the potato plants, noting their healthy appearance and the size of the tubers she could see exposed near the surface. "These look excellent. How much acreage needs to be harvested?" "About 4 acres of potatoes, 2 acres of squash, and most of the apple crop," Tom replied. "Plus there's the root cellar to organize and the preserving to get done before winter sets in properly." Emma did quick calculations in her head, estimating the work involved and the time available before winter weather made outdoor labor impossible. It was a substantial amount of work for 2 people, but manageable if they worked efficiently and the weather cooperated. "I can help with all of that," she said confidently. "I've done harvest work before, and I know how to preserve vegetables and fruit." Tom studied her face, perhaps looking for signs of false bravado or city-bred naivety. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded approvingly. "We'll start with the potatoes," he decided. "They're the most urgent, and they require the most physical labor. If you're still willing to work after a day of digging potatoes, I'll know you're serious about earning your keep." Emma appreciated his directness and the implicit challenge in his words. She had indeed grown up doing farm work, helping her mother's family during summer visits to their homestead outside Denver. But that had been years ago, and she wasn't entirely certain her soft city hands were prepared for the reality of sustained physical labor. "What about clothing?" she asked, looking down at her traveling dress. "I don't have anything appropriate for farm work." Tom considered this practical problem, his gaze assessing her size and build without making her feel uncomfortable. "I've got some old shirts and pants that might work temporarily. They'll be too big, but you can roll up the sleeves and cuffs. And there's a general store in Copper Falls where you can buy proper work clothes once you've earned some money." The mention of earning money reminded Emma that she was still essentially penniless, dependent on Tom's generosity for everything from food to shelter. The thought of being able to work for wages, to contribute something meaningful rather than simply accepting charity, was enormously appealing. "How much would you pay for harvest help?" she asked. "Standard rate is $2 a day plus room and board," Tom replied. "Same as I pay the men I hire from town during busy seasons." Emma felt a surge of relief at his matter-of-fact tone. Tom was offering to pay her the same wage he would pay any hired hand, treating her as a legitimate worker rather than a woman playing at farm labor. $2 a day would allow her to buy proper clothes, save some money for the future, and maintain her independence even while accepting his help. "That sounds fair," she said. "When do we start?" Tom smiled, the expression transforming his serious face and revealing the humor that lurked beneath his practical exterior. "Right after I find you some work clothes and show you how I like the potatoes handled." They returned to the cabin, where Tom produced a collection of worn but clean clothing from a chest in his bedroom. The pants and shirts were indeed much too large for Emma's slight frame, but they were made of sturdy cloth that would protect her from thorns and rough work. She retired to her room to change, rolling up sleeves and pant legs until the garments were manageable, then securing everything with pieces of rope Tom provided as makeshift belts and ties. When she emerged, Tom's expression suggested approval mixed with amusement. "You look like you're wearing a tent," he observed, "but it'll do for work purposes." Emma glanced down at herself and had to laugh. The oversized clothes did indeed make her look like a child playing dress-up in adult clothing, but they were comfortable and practical, which was all that mattered for the task ahead. Tom equipped her with a pair of sturdy gloves and showed her the proper technique for digging potatoes, using a specialized fork to loosen the soil around each plant before carefully extracting the tubers without damaging them. The work required a combination of strength and finesse, getting the timing right to avoid cutting into the vegetables while still working efficiently. "The key is rhythm," Tom explained, demonstrating the smooth motion that lifted each plant cleanly. "You want to work steadily but not rush. Damaged potatoes won't store well, so it's better to work carefully than quickly." Emma watched his technique carefully, then tried to replicate it on the next plant. Her first attempts were clumsy, but Tom patiently corrected her form until she began to develop the proper rhythm. The work was harder than she'd expected, requiring sustained bending and lifting that quickly made her back ache. But there was something satisfying about the steady accumulation of perfectly harvested vegetables. They worked side by side through the morning, filling baskets with potatoes of all sizes and carrying them to the wagon Tom had positioned at the edge of the field. The autumn sun was warm despite the cool air, and Emma soon found herself working up a sweat despite the temperature. Tom set a steady pace that was challenging but not overwhelming, and he seemed pleased with Emma's determination to keep up. "You're getting the hang of it," he said, as they paused for water around mid-morning. "Better than some of the men I've hired from town." Emma felt a flush of pride at his praise. She'd been worried that her weeks of inadequate nutrition and minimal physical activity would leave her too weak for sustained labor. But the combination of good food and rest seemed to have restored more of her strength than she'd realized. As they worked, Tom began to tell her about his life on the mountain, his voice mixing with the rhythm of their labor to create an oddly intimate atmosphere. He'd bought the land from a prospector who'd given up looking for gold, recognizing that the valley's real wealth lay in its soil and water rather than mineral deposits. The first 2 years had been spent building the cabin and barn, clearing fields, and establishing the basic infrastructure needed for farming. It was lonely work, Tom admitted, pausing to wipe sweat from his forehead. "Especially the first winter, when I was snowed in for 3 months with nobody to talk to but the horses. Emma tried to imagine what it would be like to spend months in complete isolation, responsible for every aspect of survival in an environment that could be beautiful but also deadly. Didn't you ever think about giving up and moving back to civilization? Tom was quiet for a moment, his hands continuing the steady work of digging while he considered her question. I thought about it, he said finally. But where would I go? The war changed a lot of things for a lot of people. The life I had before doesn't exist anymore, and I'm not sure I'd want it back even if it did. There was something in his tone that suggested deeper wounds than simple displacement, but Emma didn't press for details. She was learning that Tom Mitchell was a man who revealed himself gradually, in small pieces rather than dramatic confessions. By the time they stopped for lunch, they had cleared nearly half an acre of potatoes, a productivity rate that Tom seemed to find satisfactory. Emma's back ached, and her hands were sore despite the gloves, but she felt a deep sense of accomplishment at the tangible evidence of their morning's work. Tom prepared a simple meal of cold meat, cheese, and fresh bread, which they ate sitting on the porch of the cabin with the harvested field spread out before them. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and the distant sound of cattle lowing in their pasture, creating an atmosphere of peaceful productivity that Emma found deeply appealing. Tell me about Copper Falls, she said, curious about the community that served as Tom's connection to the outside world. Small town, maybe 200 people on a busy day, Tom replied. Started as a mining camp, but most of the easy gold played out years ago. Now it's mostly loggers and ranchers, people who are trying to build something permanent rather than just extract what they can and move on. Emma nodded, understanding the distinction he was making between communities built on sustainable industries versus those dependent on depleting natural resources. Do you go to town often? Once or twice a month for supplies and mail, Tom said. Sometimes more during busy seasons when I need extra help or equipment. The people are good folks mostly, but they keep to themselves and expect others to do the same. Emma appreciated this description of a community that valued privacy and self-reliance. It suggested that her presence at Tom's farm might not attract the kind of unwanted attention that could lead to questions about her past or her reasons for being in Colorado territory. What about neighbors? She asked. Are there other farms nearby? Tom pointed toward a distant column of smoke rising from the valley below. Henry Blake has a place about 3 miles down the creek. He's a doctor who retired from practice in Kansas City and decided to try his hand at ranching. Good man, though he's still learning the difference between treating patients and treating cattle. The mention of a doctor made Emma slightly nervous, remembering her stepfather's connections throughout Colorado's medical community. But 3 miles was a considerable distance in mountain country, and a retired doctor from Kansas was unlikely to have dealings with Denver society. Anyone else? There's a widow named Margaret Foster who runs the general store in town, Tom continued. She's got a son Daniel who helps with heavy work around various farms. And Sheriff Harper keeps the peace, though there's not much peace that needs keeping in a place like this. Emma filed away these names and descriptions, beginning to build a mental picture of the community she might be joining, at least temporarily. The small size and tight-knit nature of the area appealed to her, offering the possibility of belonging somewhere without the complicated social hierarchies that had made her life in Denver so difficult. After lunch, they returned to the potato field, working through the afternoon until the sun began to sink toward the western peaks. Emma's initial enthusiasm was tempered by growing fatigue, but she was determined to prove herself capable of sustained work. Tom seemed to understand her need to demonstrate her competence, maintaining their steady pace while occasionally adjusting his technique to accommodate her smaller stature and lesser strength. By evening, they had completed the harvest of the entire potato field, accomplishment that Tom declared satisfactory for a full day's work. The wagon was loaded with baskets of perfect tubers, ready to be transported to the root cellar for winter storage. Emma's hands were blistered despite the gloves, and every muscle in her body ached, but she felt a deep satisfaction at having contributed something meaningful to the operation of Tom's farm. You did good work today, Tom said as they walked back toward the cabin in the gathering dusk. Better than I expected, if I'm being honest. Emma appreciated his honesty, even if it stung slightly to know that he'd had doubts about her capabilities. I told you I wasn't afraid of hard work. You did, Tom agreed. But saying and doing are different things. You did the work, and did it well. That evening, Tom prepared a substantial dinner while Emma soaked her sore hands in warm water and reflected on her first day of real labor in weeks. The combination of physical exhaustion and genuine accomplishment was oddly satisfying, giving her a sense of purpose that had been missing during her weeks of uncertain travel. Over dinner, their conversation ranged from practical matters like the next day's work schedule to more personal topics about their respective backgrounds. Emma found herself sharing carefully edited stories about her childhood, focusing on the summers spent at her mother's family farm rather than the complicated circumstances of her life in Denver. Tom reciprocated with tales of his early years in Colorado, the challenges of establishing a working farm from scratch, and the satisfaction of building something lasting with his own hands. What made you choose this particular valley? Emma asked as they finished eating. Tom was quiet for a moment, gazing out the window toward the darkening mountains. I suppose it chose me as much as I chose it, he said finally. I was looking for somewhere I could work hard enough to sleep without dreaming, and this place provided that. Emma understood that there were depths to his answer that he wasn't ready to explore, just as there were aspects of her own story that remained carefully unexamined. But she was beginning to appreciate the way Tom Mitchell approached both work and relationships with the same steady patience, allowing things to develop naturally rather than forcing premature intimacy or disclosure. As the evening progressed and they sat by the fire, Emma found herself studying Tom's profile in the flickering light. He was reading a book, something about agricultural techniques, his expression focused and thoughtful. There was something deeply attractive about his self-sufficiency and competence, the way he had built a life that was both challenging and fulfilling without depending on anyone else for validation or support. Tom, she said, interrupting his reading. Thank you for today. For treating me like a real worker instead of a charity case. Tom looked up from his book, his pale blue eyes serious in the firelight. Emma, you earned your pay today. You don't owe me thanks for acknowledging that. Emma felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with being seen and valued for her actual contributions rather than her circumstances. For the first time since fleeing Denver, she began to think that she might have found not just temporary safety, but a place where she could build something meaningful. What's the plan for tomorrow? She asked. More of the same, Tom replied. We'll start on the squash harvest, then begin organizing the root cellar for storage. If we maintain today's pace, we should have everything harvested before the first hard frost. Emma nodded, already anticipating the satisfaction of another day of productive work. Her hands would be sore and her back would ache, but she would be earning her place in Tom Mitchell's world through honest labor and proven competence. It was more than she had dared to hope for when she'd collapsed on his trail, and it was enough to let her sleep peacefully for the second night in his spare room, secure in the knowledge that she was no longer simply running from something but working towards something better. 3 weeks into her stay at Tom's farm, Emma had settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. The autumn harvest was progressing steadily, and her hands had developed calluses that allowed her to work without the constant discomfort of those first few days. She woke each morning to the sound of Tom starting the fire and beginning his daily chores, and she found herself looking forward to their shared breakfast and the planning of the day's work. The squash harvest had proven even more challenging than the potatoes, requiring careful timing to avoid frost damage while ensuring the vegetables were fully mature. Emma had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when each variety was ready, from the deep orange color of the pumpkins to the hard rinds of the winter squash that would feed them through the cold months ahead. This morning brought the first real frost of the season, coating the grass and remaining crops with a delicate layer of ice crystals that sparkled in the early sunlight. Emma stood at her bedroom window, admiring the way the frost transformed the familiar landscape into something magical and otherworldly. But she also knew that this weather change marked the beginning of the end for outdoor harvest work, adding urgency to their efforts to complete the gathering of the orchard crops. Tom was already loading the apple-picking ladder onto the wagon when Emma emerged from the cabin, dressed now in the practical clothes she'd purchased during her single trip to Copper Falls the week before. Margaret Foster, the woman who ran the general store, had proven to be exactly the kind of warm, efficient person Tom had described, helping Emma select sturdy work clothes and asking no uncomfortable questions about her background or her relationship with Tom. "Good morning," Tom said, securing the ladder with practiced movements. "Ready to tackle the apple trees?" Emma nodded, appreciating the way Tom always phrased their work as a shared endeavor rather than something he was doing while she helped. Over the weeks of working together, they had developed an easy partnership that maximized both their strengths, with Tom handling the heaviest physical labor while Emma managed the detail work that required patience and careful attention. The apple orchard occupied a sheltered spot near the creek, where the trees were protected from the worst of the mountain winds while still receiving adequate sunlight. Tom had planted the trees shortly after acquiring the property, and they were now mature enough to produce substantial crops of several varieties, from early-season eating apples to late-harvest varieties that would store well through the winter. "We'll start with the northern spy trees," Tom decided, examining the heavily laden branches. "They're the best keepers, so we want to get them picked and stored before any more frost damage occurs." Emma had become adept at reading the subtle signs that indicated when apples were ready for harvest, checking for the right color, firmness, and the ease with which the fruit separated from the branch. She climbed the ladder with confidence now, her balance improved by weeks of physical work, while Tom positioned himself to catch the apples she dropped into the baskets below. Working in the orchard was different from the field harvest, requiring more conversation and coordination as they moved the ladder from tree to tree and sorted the apples according to quality and intended use. The best specimens would go into storage for winter eating, while damaged or inferior fruit would be processed into cider, sauce, or dried for preservation. "Tell me about your family," Tom said, as they worked through the morning, his voice carrying easily over the sound of apples dropping into baskets. "You've mentioned your mother but not much else." Emma paused in her picking, considering how much of her story she was willing to share. Over the weeks of working together, Tom had proven himself to be both trustworthy and discreet, but her situation was complicated enough that complete honesty might put them both at risk. "My mother died when I was 17, she said finally. "She was the only family that really mattered to me. My father died when I was young, and my mother remarried, but that didn't work out well for anyone involved." Tom seemed to understand that there were painful details behind her carefully neutral words. "I'm sorry about your mother. It's hard to lose the people who really understand us." Emma appreciated his sympathy without pressing for details. "What about your family? You've never mentioned anyone from before you came to Colorado." Tom was quiet for a long moment, his hands continuing to sort apples while he considered his response. "My parents died in a cholera outbreak when I was 16. After that, it was just me and the army until I bought this place." Emma climbed down from the ladder and moved to the next tree, processing this information about Tom's background. The loss of his parents at such a young age explained some of his self-reliance and his ability to create a meaningful life without depending on others for emotional support. "The army was your family," she said, understanding. For a while Tom agreed. "But war changes things. Changes people. After it was over, I needed something different." Emma sensed that there were stories behind Tom's service that he wasn't ready to share, just as there were aspects of her own past that remained carefully guarded. But she was beginning to understand that they were both people who had been shaped by loss and displacement, finding ways to build new lives from whatever materials were available to them. The morning progressed with the steady rhythm of productive work, their conversation flowing naturally from practical matters to more personal topics. Emma found herself sharing edited stories about her childhood, focusing on happy memories of time spent with her mother rather than the difficult years that followed her death. Tom reciprocated with tales of his early days in Colorado, the challenges of learning to farm through trial and error, and his gradual acceptance of the solitary life he'd created. "I used to think I was meant to be alone," Tom said as they paused for water and a brief rest. "Seemed like every time I got attached to people or places, something happened to tear it all apart." Emma studied his profile as he gazed across the valley, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into sun and weather, but also of grief, carefully managed and dreams cautiously held. "What changed your mind?" Tom turned to look at her directly, his pale blue eyes serious in the morning light. "I suppose having someone to share the work with reminded me that some kinds of solitude are chosen, and some are just empty." Emma felt something shift in her chest at his words, a recognition that their partnership had evolved beyond simple employer and employee into something more complex and meaningful. She had been so focused on proving her competence and earning her place that she hadn't fully acknowledged how much she had come to value, not just the security Tom provided, but his company itself. "I know what you mean," she said softly. "I'd forgotten what it was like to have someone to plan with, to share the satisfaction of work completed together." They resumed their picking with a new awareness humming between them, though neither pushed the conversation toward more explicit acknowledgement of what was developing. Emma had learned that Tom approached personal relationships with the same patience he brought to farming, allowing things to grow naturally rather than forcing premature declarations or commitments. By midday, they had filled nearly a dozen baskets with perfect apples, a harvest that would provide fresh fruit well into the winter months, and enough surplus to trade in town for goods Tom couldn't produce himself. The work was satisfying in a way that Emma's previous life had never provided, offering tangible evidence of productivity and the security that came from preparing adequately for future needs. As they loaded the wagon for transport back to the cabin, Emma noticed a rider approaching from the direction of town, moving at a pace that suggested either urgency or excitement. Tom noticed the visitor at the same time, his posture subtly shifting as he prepared to deal with whatever news or business the rider might bring. The man who dismounted near their wagon was Daniel Foster, Margaret's son, a cheerful young man in his early 20s, who often helped with seasonal work around the valley's various farms. But today his usual easy smile was replaced by an expression of concern that immediately put Emma on alert. "Morning, Tom," Daniel said, touching his hat brim politely. "Miss Wright." Emma appreciated the way the residents of Copper Falls had accepted her presence without extensive questioning, treating her as Tom's hired help, rather than an object of romantic speculation. Margaret Foster had established this tone during Emma's visit to the general store, introducing her to other customers, as someone helping with the harvest rather than making assumptions about her personal relationship with Tom. "Daniel," Tom replied. "What brings you up the mountain today?" Daniel glanced between Tom and Emma, clearly weighing how much information to share. "There's been some strangers in town asking questions. Men from back east, well-dressed, carrying themselves like they're used to getting answers whether folks want to give them or not." Emma felt her blood turn cold, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. She had known this moment might come, but she had hoped that her trail had grown cold during the weeks of mountain travel, and that her stepfather would eventually give up the search. "What kind of questions?" Tom asked, his voice carefully casual. "About whether anyone had seen a young woman traveling lone, someone who might have come through in the past month or so," Daniel replied. They had a description that was pretty detailed, down to the color of her hair and the clothes she was wearing. Emma's hand instinctively went to her hair, which she had been wearing in a simple braid for farm work rather than the elaborate styles that had been fashionable in Denver. But the basic color and texture couldn't be disguised, and if the searchers were thorough, they would eventually make their way to every farm and homestead in the area. "Did anyone tell them anything useful?" Tom asked. Daniel shook his head.
Folks in Copper Falls don't take kindly to strangers demanding information about their neighbors. Sheriff Harper made it clear that the valley residents' business was their own, and if these men wanted to conduct any kind of official search, they'd need proper warrants and jurisdiction. Emma felt a surge of gratitude for the mountain community's instinctive protectiveness of its members. But she also knew that determined searchers with adequate resources would eventually find ways around local resistance. "How many men?" Tom inquired. "Three that I saw," Daniel replied. "Could be more staying at the hotel or camped outside town. They had the look of men who are used to getting their way, and they didn't seem discouraged by the lack of cooperation they received." Tom nodded thoughtfully, processing this information while maintaining the calm demeanor that Emma had learned to associate with his military background. "Thank you for the warning, Daniel. I appreciate you taking the trouble to ride up here." "No trouble," Daniel said, remounting his horse. "Just thought you should know what's happening in town." After Daniel rode away, Tom and Emma stood beside the loaded wagon. The morning's easy companionship replaced by tension and the weight of decisions that needed to be made. Emma knew that the searchers her stepfather had sent would not give up easily, and their presence in Copper Falls meant that her location would eventually be discovered unless she took action to prevent it. "I should leave," Emma said quietly. "I won't bring trouble to your home." Tom turned to face her fully, his expression serious but not panicked. "Where would you go?" Emma realized she had no answer to his question. The weeks of safety and productive work had allowed her to avoid thinking about long-term plans, but now she was forced to confront the reality that she had no destination, no resources beyond what she had earned working for Tom, and no clear strategy for evading determined pursuit. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I can't stay here and put you at risk." Tom was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving across the valley that had become home to both of them. "What exactly are you running from, Emma? I think it's time I knew the whole story." Emma took a deep breath, knowing that Tom deserved the truth if he was going to help her make intelligent decisions about what came next. Over the weeks of working together, she had come to trust his judgment and his discretion, and she realized that trying to handle this crisis alone would be both foolish and unfair. "My stepfather arranged a marriage for me," she said simply. "To a man with a reputation for violence toward women, when I refused, he made it clear that my cooperation wasn't required for the arrangement to proceed." Tom's expression darkened as he absorbed the implications of her words. "So you ran?" "I ran," Emma confirmed. "But apparently not far enough or well enough to discourage pursuit." Tom walked to the edge of the orchard, looking down the valley toward the town where men were searching for the woman who had become essential to his daily happiness. Emma watched him think, recognizing the careful consideration he brought to all important decisions. "How long before they work their way up to this farm?" he asked. Emma considered the geography and the systematic approach that professional searchers would likely employ. "A few days at most, assuming they check every property in the area." Tom nodded, confirming his own assessment. "Then we have time to plan." Emma felt a surge of hope at his use of the word "we," though she was careful not to read too much into what might simply be his natural inclination to help someone in trouble. "What kind of plan?" she asked. Tom returned to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring even in the face of approaching danger. "The kind that gives you choices beyond running or surrendering. But first, I need to know more about these men who are looking for you. Are they law enforcement, private investigators, or something else?" Emma thought about the resources her stepfather commanded, and the methods he would likely employ to retrieve what he considered his property. "Probably private men hired for the purpose. My stepfather has money and connections, but he wouldn't want to involve official law enforcement in what amounts to a family dispute." "That's useful information," Tom said. "Private men have limitations that official authorities don't have. They can't force entry or demand cooperation the way a sheriff with a warrant could." Emma began to understand that Tom's military background included more than just farming and construction skills. His calm assessment of the threat and his immediate shift into strategic thinking suggested experience with situations where careful planning meant the difference between success and disaster. "What are you thinking?" she asked. Tom looked at her directly,
his pale blue eyes holding an intensity she'd seen before but never directed toward her personally. I'm thinking that a woman who can work a full harvest and never complain about sore hands isn't someone who should be forced into marriage against her will. Emma felt her heart skip at his words, recognizing both support for her autonomy and something deeper that made her pulse quicken despite the dangerous circumstances. Tom, I can't ask you to fight my battles for me. You're not asking, Tom replied simply. I'm offering. And Emma, after these past weeks, I'd say we've moved beyond the kind of relationship where your problems aren't my problems. The admission hung between them, acknowledged but not fully explored as they both recognized that the approaching threat required immediate practical attention rather than romantic declarations. All right, Emma said. What do you suggest? Tom was quiet for another moment, his mind clearly working through possibilities and contingencies. First, we finish this harvest. If we're going to face trouble, we do it after we've secured the winter's food supply. Second, we gather information about exactly who these men are and what authority they think they have. Third, we make sure that when they do find their way here, they discover that Emma Wright isn't someone who can be taken easily. Emma stared at him, surprised by his assumption that resistance was possible rather than futile. You think we can actually prevent them from taking me back? I think that 3 well-dressed men from back east are a long way from their usual sources of support, Tom said. And I think that a woman who's established herself as a member of this community has more rights and protections than they probably realize. Emma felt something she had almost forgotten during the weeks of fear and flight, the possibility that she might actually have some control over her own fate. Tom's confidence wasn't based on wishful thinking but on practical assessment of their advantages and the searcher's limitations. What about the immediate situation? She asked. If they're systematically checking properties, they'll reach this farm soon. Tom smiled, the expression holding more determination than humor. Then we make sure that when they get here they find exactly what they expect to find and nothing more. Emma looked at him questioningly, not understanding his meaning. They're looking for a refined woman from Denver who's traveling alone and probably desperate, Tom explained. They're not looking for a hired hand who's been working harvest for a month and has a legitimate place in the community. Emma began to understand his strategy. You think they won't recognize me if I look like what I've become rather than what I was? I think people see what they expect to see, Tom said. And I think we can make sure their expectations work in our favor. As they loaded the apple baskets onto the wagon and prepared to return to the cabin, Emma felt the first stirring of hope that she had experienced since learning of the searcher's presence in town. Tom Mitchell's calm confidence and strategic thinking were already beginning to transform what had seemed like inevitable capture into a problem that might actually have solutions. The weeks of shared work and growing trust had created something between them that was stronger than employer and employee, more significant than simple friendship. And now, faced with the first real test of that developing relationship, Tom was making it clear that he considered her worth fighting for. Emma climbed onto the wagon seat beside Tom, her mind already shifting from panic to planning as they drove back toward the cabin that had become more of a home than anywhere she had lived since her mother's death. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them as part of a partnership that had been forged through honest work and mutual respect, with a man who saw her as someone worth protecting rather than property to be claimed. The transformation began immediately upon their return to the cabin. Tom moved with the same methodical efficiency he brought to all his work, but now directed toward creating a deception that would protect Emma from discovery. He produced clothing that was even more worn and practical than what she had been wearing, garments that had seen years of hard use and bore the stains of honest labor. If they're looking for a lady, we'll make sure they see a farm hand, Tom explained, helping Emma understand how to alter her posture and mannerisms to match her new role. Keep your head down, speak only when spoken to, and let me do most of the talking. Emma practiced walking with the slightly stooped shoulders of someone accustomed to heavy physical labor, tying her hair back in the simple style favored by working women rather than the elaborate arrangements she had worn in Denver. The weeks of actual farm work had already changed her hands and complexion, giving her the weathered appearance that would support their deception. What about my voice? Emma asked, recognizing that her educated speech patterns might give her away despite her altered appearance. Say as little as possible, Tom advised. If you must speak, keep your answers short and focus on practical matters. You've been working here for months, earning wages like any other hired hand. They spent the afternoon rehearsing their story, creating a history for Emma's employment that would satisfy casual questioning while avoiding details that might trip them up under more intensive scrutiny. Tom coached her on local terminology and farming practices, ensuring that her responses would sound authentic to anyone familiar with agricultural work. As evening approached, Tom made an unexpected announcement. "I'm riding to town tonight to gather more information about these searchers. I want to know exactly what they're telling people and how they're conducting their investigation." Emma felt a surge of anxiety at the thought of being left alone while unknown men hunted for her throughout the valley. Is that wise? What if they recognize you as someone who might be harboring me? Tom's expression was calm but determined. "They have no reason to suspect me specifically, and I need to understand what we're dealing with. Information is the most important weapon we have right now." Emma recognized the wisdom in his approach, though she hated the thought of spending the night wondering whether Tom would return safely or whether the searchers might discover his connection to her through their investigation. "Be careful," she said, meaning it more deeply than the simple words could convey. Tom paused in his preparations, looking at her with an intensity that made her heart race despite their dangerous circumstances. "Emma, I want you to know that whatever happens, these past weeks have meant more to me than I expected when I first found you on that trail." Emma felt tears prick her eyes at his words, recognizing both a declaration and a potential farewell. "We'll talk when I get back," Tom interrupted gently. "Right now I need to focus on making sure we have a future to discuss." After Tom rode away into the gathering darkness, Emma found herself alone in the cabin for the first time since her arrival. The silence felt oppressive after weeks of shared meals and comfortable conversation, and she struggled to occupy herself with useful tasks while her mind churned with worry about Tom's safety and their uncertain future. She organized the root cellar, arranging the harvested vegetables according to the system Tom had taught her, taking comfort in the familiar work while straining to hear any sound that might indicate approaching riders. The abundant stores of food they had gathered together represented security and survival through the winter months. But now Emma wondered whether she would be present to share in the sustenance they had worked so hard to provide. Near midnight, she heard hoofbeats approaching the cabin, and her heart leaped with relief when she recognized Tom's distinctive whistle announcing his return. She met him at the door, noting the grim expression on his face that suggested his reconnaissance had revealed troubling information. "What did you learn?" Emma asked, as Tom tended to his horse and settled by the fire. "They're professionals," Tom reported. "Former Pinkerton agents, according to Sheriff Harper, hired specifically to locate and retrieve you. They have a substantial amount of money to spend on the search, and they're not planning to give up easily." Emma sank into a chair, absorbing the implications of Tom's intelligence gathering. Professional investigators would be more thorough and persistent than the casual searchers she had hoped to evade. "There's more," Tom continued. "They've been asking specific questions about single women who might have taken employment on area farms. Someone gave them information about your general description and suggested that you might be working rather than simply hiding." Emma felt a chill of fear at this news. "How could anyone know that?" "Probably deduced it from the pattern of your travel and the time you've been missing," Tom said. "These men are experienced at finding people who don't want to be found." Emma stared into the fire, watching the flames dance while she processed this information. The searchers were closing in with systematic thoroughness, and her disguise as a farm worker might not be sufficient to fool investigators who were specifically looking for a woman in exactly that situation. "How much time do we have?" she asked. "They're planning to start checking the outlying farms tomorrow," Tom replied. "We'll probably see them by late afternoon, assuming they work their way up the valley in logical order." Emma nodded, trying to remain calm while her mind raced through their limited options. Running would only delay the inevitable, and she had no resources for extended flight. Fighting was impossible against 3 professional investigators backed by her stepfather's money and legal authority. "Tom," she said quietly, "maybe I should just go with them. At least that way you won't be involved in whatever consequences follow." Tom's response was immediate and definitive. "That's not happening." Emma looked up at him, surprised by the vehemence in his voice. "You can't fight my family's money and connections. These men will take me back regardless of what either of us wants." Tom moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his work-roughened ones. Emma, I've spent 5 years building a life worth living on this mountain. But these past weeks with you have shown me that a life worth living is one worth sharing with someone who matters. Emma felt her breath catch at his words, recognizing a declaration that went far beyond simple partnership or mutual attraction. I love you, Tom said simply. I love your strength and your determination and the way you've made this place feel like more than just a refuge from the world. I love the future I can see when I imagine us working together, building something that belongs to both of us. Emma felt tears spill down her cheeks as she absorbed the magnitude of what Tom was offering. I love you too, she whispered. More than I thought possible. But love doesn't solve the practical problem of 3 men with legal authority to take me back to Denver. Tom smiled, his expression holding confidence that seemed impossible given their circumstances. Actually, it might solve exactly that problem. Emma looked at him questioningly, not understanding his meaning. Marriage laws in Colorado territory are very specific about a woman's right to choose her own husband. Tom explained. Once we're legally married, your stepfather's arrangement becomes void, and these investigators lose their authority to remove you against your will. Emma stared at Tom, hardly daring to believe that such a simple solution might actually work. You're proposing marriage as a legal strategy. I'm proposing marriage because I want to spend the rest of my life with you, Tom corrected. The legal protection is just a practical benefit of doing what I wanted to do anyway. Emma's mind raced through the implications of Tom's proposal. Marriage would indeed provide legal protection, but it would also commit them to a future together that they had only just begun to explore. The intensity of their feelings was real, but they had known each other for only a few weeks. Tom, we barely know each other, she said, though her heart was already responding to the possibility he offered. I know that you work harder than anyone I've ever met. Tom replied. I know that you face problems head-on instead of running from them. I know that you've made my life better in every way since the day I found you. What else do I need to know? Emma realized that Tom was right about the essential things. The weeks of shared work and conversation had revealed their characters to each other in ways that years of formal courtship might not have accomplished. She knew that Tom was honest, competent, and kind. She knew that he treated her as an equal partner rather than a dependent. She knew that the life they had begun building together was more fulfilling than anything she had experienced in her previous existence. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you. Tom's smile transformed his serious face, revealing joy that made Emma's heart soar despite their dangerous circumstances. Tomorrow morning, we'll ride to town and find Reverend Morrison. Colorado law only requires witnesses and a minister, so we can be married before those investigators reach this farm. Emma felt a surge of hope mixed with lingering anxiety about the logistics of their plan. What if they're watching the town? What if they see us together? Then we make sure they see exactly what we want them to see. Tom said, a local farmer conducting business in town with one of his seasonal workers. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost covering everything in crystalline beauty that seemed to mock the tension of their situation. Emma dressed in her most worn work clothes, binding her hair severely and adopting the posture of a woman accustomed to deference and hard labor. Tom coached her once more on their cover story before they set out for Copper Falls. The ride to town felt simultaneously eternal and too brief, giving Emma time to second-guess their plan while also bringing them closer to the moment when their deception would be tested. Tom maintained his usual calm demeanor, but Emma could see the alertness in his posture that indicated he was prepared for trouble. Copper Falls looked deceptively peaceful in the morning light, with smoke rising from chimneys and the usual bustle of people going about their daily business. But Emma noticed strangers loitering near the hotel and general store, well-dressed men who studied every passerby with professional interest. There, Tom murmured, nodding toward 2 men standing outside the sheriff's office. Those must be our investigators. Emma forced herself to look down and keep walking, playing her role as Tom's hired hand while her heart pounded with anxiety. The men looked exactly as dangerous as she had feared, with the confident bearing of people accustomed to getting results through persistence and intimidation. Tom guided them toward the small church at the end of Main Street, where Reverend Morrison was tending to his garden despite the cold weather.
The elderly minister looked up with surprise at their approach, clearly not expecting visitors so early in the day. "Tom Mitchell," the Reverend said warmly. "What brings you to town this morning?" "Reverend Morrison, I'd like you to meet Emma Wright," Tom replied, helping Emma down from the wagon. "We've come to ask if you'd perform a marriage ceremony for us." The Reverend's eyebrows rose in surprise, but his expression quickly shifted to pleased approval. "Well, this is wonderful news. I've been hoping you'd find someone to share that mountain of yours." Emma felt a flutter of nervousness as Reverend Morrison's attention focused on her, wondering whether her disguise would hold up under closer scrutiny. But the minister seemed to see only what Tom's introduction had led him to expect: a working woman who had captured the attention of one of the valley's most eligible bachelors. "Do you have witnesses?" Reverend Morrison asked, leading them into the small church. "Margaret Foster said she'd be honored to stand for us," Tom replied. "And Daniel can serve as the second witness." Within an hour, Emma found herself standing before the altar of the small church, her hand clasped in Tom's, while Reverend Morrison spoke the words that would legally unite them as husband and wife. Margaret Foster beamed with maternal approval, while Daniel grinned at the romantic drama of the sudden wedding. "Do you, Thomas Mitchell, take Emma Wright to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Morrison asked. "I do," Tom replied, his voice steady and sure. "Do you, Emma Wright, take Thomas Mitchell to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Emma said, meaning it with every fiber of her being despite the unusual circumstances. "By the authority vested in me by Colorado Territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Morrison declared. "You may kiss your bride." Tom's kiss was gentle but thorough, sealing their union with tenderness that made Emma forget momentarily about the dangerous men searching for her throughout the town. When they separated, she saw in his eyes the same mixture of love and determination that had driven him to offer this solution to her impossible situation. The marriage certificate was signed and witnessed, creating the legal document that would protect Emma from forced removal. But as they prepared to leave the church, Tom's posture suddenly tensed, and Emma followed his gaze to see one of the investigators approaching the church entrance. "Remember your role," Tom murmured quietly. "You're my hired hand who happened to witness the ceremony." The investigator was a tall, well-dressed man with cold eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to intimidating people into cooperation. He stepped into the church just as they were gathering their papers, his gaze sweeping over the small group with professional assessment. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate attention. "I'm looking for information about a missing woman, and I wondered if any of you might have seen her." He produced a photograph from his jacket, and Emma's heart nearly stopped when she recognized her own face staring back at her from the formal portrait her stepfather had commissioned the previous year. The woman in the photograph bore little resemblance to the work-worn farmhand standing in the church, but Emma held her breath as the investigator's gaze passed over her. "Pretty young lady," Margaret Foster observed, studying the photograph with apparent interest. "But I can't say I've seen her around the—" "What she wanted for?" "Family matter," the investigator replied curtly. "She's been missing for several weeks and her family is concerned for her safety." Tom stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Emma and the investigator while maintaining the casual demeanor of someone with nothing to hide. "Can't help you there, friend. We've all been too busy with harvest work to pay much attention to strangers passing through." The investigator's attention shifted to Tom, assessing him as a potential source of information. "You're a local farmer?" "Tom Mitchell," Tom replied, extending his hand in the friendly manner typical of mountain communities. "I've got a place up the valley. Just came to town to get married." The investigator's gaze moved to Emma with renewed interest, but he seemed to see only what Tom's introduction suggested: a local woman who had captured the attention of a prosperous farmer. "Congratulations," the investigator said without warmth. "I don't suppose you've hired any new workers recently." This woman might have sought employment on one of the area farms. "Just my usual seasonal help," Tom replied easily. "Same folks I hire every year for planting and harvest." Emma forced herself to remain silent and deferential, playing the role of a farmhand who had no reason to involve herself in the conversation between the men. The investigator's gaze passed over her again, but the photograph in his hand seemed to create expectations that prevented him from seeing the reality standing before him. After a few more questions that yielded no useful information, the investigator left the church, apparently satisfied that this particular group of locals had nothing to offer his investigation. Emma waited until he was well out of sight before allowing herself to breathe normally again. "That was closer than I like," Margaret Foster observed, her shrewd eyes studying Emma with newfound understanding. But he saw exactly what he expected to see, nothing more. Emma realized that Margaret had understood far more about the situation than she had let on. But the older woman's expression suggested support rather than suspicion. "Welcome to the family, dear," Margaret said warmly, embracing Emma with genuine affection. "Tom's found himself a good woman, and that's worth protecting." The ride back to the farm felt like a triumph, with Emma now legally protected from forced removal and accepted as Tom's wife by the community that had become her refuge. The investigators might continue their search, but they would find no trace of the refined Denver woman they sought among the working people of Pine Ridge Valley. That evening, as they sat by the fire in the cabin that was now truly their shared home, Emma reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from desperate flight to unexpected love. Tom had offered her work in his fields and safety in his arms, but he had given her something far more precious, the chance to become the person she was meant to be. "No regrets?" Tom asked, echoing the question he had posed that first night when she had accepted his offer of shelter. "Only one," Emma replied, settling into his arms with complete contentment. "What's that?" "That it took me so long to find my way to this mountain," she said softly. Tom smiled and pulled her closer, both of them watching the fire burn down to glowing embers while outside the wind sang through the pines, carrying with it the promise of winter storms and spring plantings, of seasons to be shared, and a future to be built together in the valley they would always call home. The investigators left Copper Falls 3 days later, having found no trace of the woman they sought. Emma Wright had vanished completely, but Emma Mitchell had found her place in the world, working alongside her husband in fields that stretched toward mountains that protected them both, sleeping safely in arms that would never let her go. 6 months after their hasty wedding, Emma stood at the window of their cabin watching the first green shoots of spring emerge from the snow-covered garden. The winter had been long and harsh, but it had also been the most contented season of her life, spent in the warm glow of their hearth, while Tom carved furniture for their growing household, and she worked on the quilts and preserves that would make their mountain home even more comfortable. The investigators had never returned after their fruitless search in the fall, and Emma had gradually relaxed into the security of her new identity as Mrs. Thomas Mitchell. The legal protection of marriage had proven as effective as Tom had predicted, but more importantly, the emotional shelter of their partnership had healed wounds she hadn't even realized she carried. This morning brought news that would test their newfound peace in ways neither had anticipated. Daniel Foster had ridden up from town before dawn, his expression urgent as he delivered a message that changed everything they thought they knew about Emma's past. "There's a letter for you at the post office," Daniel had announced breathlessly. "From a lawyer in Denver. May says it's marked urgent and official looking." Emma felt her old fears resurface at the mention of Denver, but Tom's steady presence beside her provided the courage she needed to face whatever news awaited them in town. They rode to Copper Falls together, Emma's mind churning with possibilities ranging from legal challenges to their marriage, to renewed attempts by her stepfather to reclaim control over her life. Margaret Foster met them at the general store with an expression that mixed concern and curiosity, handing Emma an envelope that bore the letterhead of a prestigious Denver law firm. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she opened the sealed document, but Tom's supportive presence gave her strength to read the contents. The letter contained news so unexpected that Emma had to read it twice before fully comprehending its implications. Her stepfather, Marcus Hartwell, had died suddenly of a heart attack 3 weeks earlier, and the reading of his will had revealed information that transformed Emma's understanding of her entire situation. According to the lawyer's carefully worded explanation, Hartwell had been deeply in debt at the time of his death,
having gambled away most of the family fortune in ill-conceived business ventures. The arranged marriage to Vernon Blackwood had been motivated not by social ambition, but by desperate financial need, as Blackwood had agreed to pay substantial sums to acquire a wife from a respectable family. More shocking still, the will revealed that Emma's mother had left a significant inheritance that Hartwell had been illegally using to support his lifestyle, while denying Emma access to her rightful legacy. With Hartwell's death, the legal restrictions on Emma's inheritance had been automatically dissolved, making her the sole owner of property and investments worth considerably more than Tom's entire farm. "What does this mean?" Tom asked quietly, studying Emma's expression as she absorbed the magnitude of the news. Emma stared at the legal documents that had arrived too late to prevent her desperate flight, but which now offered possibilities she had never imagined. "It means I'm free," she said slowly. "Completely free, and apparently much wealthier than I ever knew." Margaret Foster, who had been discreetly listening to their conversation, smiled with genuine pleasure at this turn of events. "Well, that's wonderful news, dear. Justice has a way of working itself out, even when it takes longer than we'd like." Emma nodded absently, her mind struggling to process the implications of her changed circumstances. The inheritance would provide security and options she had never possessed, but it also raised complicated questions about her future with Tom and their life on the mountain. "There's more," Emma said, continuing to read through the legal papers. "The lawyer wants me to return to Denver to sign documents and take formal possession of the property. He says there are decisions that need to be made quickly about investments and business interests." Tom's expression grew thoughtful as he considered the practical aspects of Emma's inheritance. "How long would you need to be away?" Emma scanned the lawyer's letter for specific timeline information. "He estimates several weeks, possibly longer if the estate proves complicated to settle." The prospect of separation after months of constant companionship felt daunting to both of them. But Emma could see that Tom understood the importance of her handling these legal matters properly. "You should go," Tom said decisively. "This is your inheritance, your family's legacy. You need to understand what you've inherited and make informed decisions about how to manage it." Emma felt a surge of gratitude for Tom's immediate support of her need to travel to Denver, despite the personal cost of their separation. "Will you come with me?" Tom considered this possibility, his gaze moving toward the mountains that surrounded their valley home. "The spring planting needs to be done soon, and I can't leave the livestock for that long." "But Emma, this is something you need to handle on your own anyway. It's your inheritance, your decisions to make." Emma understood the wisdom in Tom's words, but the thought of returning to Denver alone, even as a married woman with legal protection, stirred anxieties she had thought were permanently buried. The city held too many painful memories and too many people who had failed to protect her when she needed help most. "I'm not the same person who fled Denver 6 months ago," Emma said, more to herself than to Tom or Margaret. "I suppose it's time to find out who I've become." The preparations for Emma's journey took a week, during which Tom helped her select appropriate clothing for her return to Denver society, while also ensuring she understood the financial aspects of farm management in case her business in the city extended longer than expected. Emma found herself studying account books and crop rotation plans with the same intensity she brought to mastering new quilting patterns, determined to be a true partner in their agricultural enterprise regardless of her personal wealth. "Remember," Tom said the night before her departure, "you're not going back as the frightened girl who ran away. You're going as Emma Mitchell, a woman who's proven she can work hard, make intelligent decisions, and build a life worth living." Emma felt the truth of his words settle into her bones, replacing old fears with new confidence. The months of shared work and mutual respect had indeed changed her in fundamental ways, giving her strengths she hadn't possessed when she first fled her stepfather's house. The journey to Denver took 3 days by stage, during which Emma had ample time to reflect on the dramatic changes in her circumstances. The landscape that had seemed so threatening during her desperate flight now appeared merely challenging, a series of obstacles to be navigated rather than insurmountable barriers to freedom. Denver itself struck her as smaller and less intimidating than she remembered, its bustling streets and elaborate buildings impressive but not overwhelming to someone who had learned to find beauty in mountain sunrises and satisfaction in honest physical labor. She registered at a respectable hotel under her married name, taking pleasure in the legal protection that simple change provided. The meeting with her stepfather's lawyer proved to be even more revealing than his initial letter had suggested. Marcus Hartwell had been living far beyond his means for years, using Emma's inheritance to maintain a lifestyle that impressed his social circle while accumulating debts that threatened financial ruin. The arranged marriage had been his final desperate attempt to solve his money problems at Emma's expense. Your mother was quite wealthy in her own right, the lawyer explained, showing Emma documents that detailed property holdings and investments she had never known existed. Hartwell convinced her to consolidate everything under his management when they married, claiming it would be more efficient. Unfortunately, he then used those assets as collateral for his own speculative ventures. Emma studied the financial records with the careful attention Tom had taught her to bring to important farm decisions, noting patterns of poor judgment and reckless spending that explained her stepfather's increasingly desperate behavior in his final years. "What's the current value of the estate?" she asked. The lawyer consulted his papers before providing a figure that made Emma's eyes widen in surprise. Even after Hartwell's debts were settled, her inheritance would be substantial enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life without working, or alternatively, to invest in business ventures that could multiply her wealth considerably. "There are several options for managing these assets," the lawyer continued. "You could maintain the current investments, liquidate everything for cash, or restructure the portfolio according to your personal preferences and risk tolerance." Emma found herself thinking about Tom's systematic approach to crop planning, balancing immediate needs against long-term sustainability, while always maintaining adequate reserves for unexpected challenges. "I'd like to review all the current investments before making any major changes. Some of them might be worth keeping, but I want to understand exactly what I own." The process of reviewing and reorganizing her inheritance took nearly 3 weeks, during which Emma discovered that her months of farm management had provided excellent preparation for handling complex financial decisions. She approached each investment with the same practical assessment Tom used when evaluating new agricultural techniques, asking pointed questions about risks, returns, and long-term viability. More importantly, the time in Denver allowed Emma to reconnect with the city as an independent adult rather than a dependent stepdaughter. She visited her mother's grave for the first time since the funeral, finally able to process her grief without the complicating influence of Hartwell's emotional manipulation. She also made contact with old friends who had disappeared from her life when her stepfather's financial problems began affecting his social standing. "Emma, you look wonderful," her childhood friend Catherine Morrison exclaimed during a carefully arranged luncheon. "There were so many rumors about what happened to you, but you seem positively radiant." Emma smiled, recognizing that Catherine was fishing for details about her sudden disappearance and equally sudden return. "I've been living in Colorado Territory. I married a farmer there." Catherine's expression suggested that she found the idea of Emma as a farmer's wife both surprising and slightly romantic. "How wonderfully adventurous. Is he handsome? Is the frontier life very primitive?" Emma thought about Tom's quiet strength and competence, his ability to create beauty and comfort from raw materials and honest labor. "He's the most capable man I've ever known, and our life together is anything but primitive. We've built something substantial and lasting." As she spoke the words, Emma realized how much she missed Tom and their shared daily routine. Denver offered sophisticated pleasures and cultural opportunities that were unavailable in Pine Ridge Valley, but none of them provided the deep satisfaction she found in working alongside her husband toward common goals. The final week of her stay was devoted to implementing the investment restructuring she had planned, liquidating speculative holdings in favor of more stable assets while maintaining enough liquid capital to fund improvements to Tom's farm. Emma had decided to surprise her husband with proposals for expanding their agricultural operation, adding new equipment and livestock that would increase both productivity and profitability. She also made arrangements to establish a Denver agent who could manage her investments without requiring her personal presence, ensuring that her inherited wealth would continue to grow while allowing her to remain permanently in Colorado Territory. The solution satisfied both her practical need for competent financial management and her emotional desire to make her home with Tom in the mountains. The return journey to Pine Ridge Valley felt like a homecoming in ways that her arrival in Denver had not. Each mile brought Emma closer to the life she had chosen and the man who had become the center of her world. She found herself eagerly anticipating the moment when she would see Tom again, when she could share both the practical details of her business success and the emotional certainty that her heart belonged permanently in the mountains. Tom was working in the fields when the stage delivered Emma to the road that led up to their farm, and she could see him look up at the sound of approaching horses. Even at a distance, she could sense his relief and happiness at her return, emotions that were confirmed when he dropped his tools and strode quickly to meet her. "Welcome home," Tom said simply, but his embrace conveyed depths of feeling that elaborate words could never have expressed. "It's good to be home," Emma replied, meaning it completely. "I have so much to tell you." That evening, as they sat by their fire sharing the meal Tom had prepared to celebrate her return, Emma explained the details of her inheritance and the investment decisions she had made. Tom listened with the same careful attention he brought to all important discussions, asking intelligent questions about her plans and expressing admiration for her handling of complex financial matters. "You've done well," Tom said when she finished her account. "Your mother would be proud of how you've taken charge of her legacy." Emma felt a warm glow of satisfaction at his approval, but more importantly, she felt the deep contentment that came from sharing important decisions with someone whose judgment she trusted completely. "There's something else," Emma said, producing the legal papers that would allow them to expand their farming operation significantly. "I want to invest some of the inheritance in our farm. New equipment, additional livestock, maybe even more land if suitable property becomes available." Tom studied the proposed investments with obvious interest, but his expression also carried a question that Emma understood without words. "This is our farm now," Emma said firmly. "Our future, our shared enterprise. The money doesn't change that, it just gives us more opportunities to build something even better together." Tom's smile conveyed both gratitude and love, but also the deeper satisfaction of a partnership that had evolved from desperation and charity into something approaching perfect equality. "In that case, Mrs. Mitchell, I think we have some serious planning to do." Over the following weeks, Emma and Tom threw themselves into designing improvements that would transform their modest mountain farm into one of the most productive and profitable operations in Colorado Territory. Emma's inheritance provided the capital for expansion, while Tom's experience and practical knowledge guided their decisions about equipment, livestock, and land use. The spring planting that year was the largest they had ever attempted, made possible by new machinery that allowed them to work more efficiently and cover more ground. Emma found herself learning to operate complex equipment while also managing the financial aspects of their expanded operation, discovering that her months of basic farm work had prepared her well for these new challenges. "You know," Tom observed one evening as they reviewed their progress toward that year's ambitious goals, "I never expected to find a business partner when I pulled you off that mountain trail." Emma laughed, remembering how desperate and helpless she had felt on the day Tom found her. "I never expected to become one, but I suppose we both got more than we bargained for." Tom's expression grew more serious as he considered the transformation they had both undergone. "Do you ever regret it? Giving up the comfortable life you could have in Denver to work this hard for uncertain returns?" Emma looked around their cabin, noting the handmade furniture Tom had crafted, the preserves and quilts she had created, the account books that showed their growing prosperity, and most of all, the sense of belonging and purpose that permeated every aspect of their shared life. "The only thing I regret," Emma said, settling into Tom's arms with complete contentment, "is that it took me so long to understand that home isn't a place you're born into. It's something you build with the person who sees who you really are and loves you for it." Tom pulled her closer, both of them gazing out the window toward fields that stretched green and promising toward mountains that sheltered their valley from the rest of the world. Outside, the night wind carried the scent of growing crops and the distant sound of cattle settling for the evening, the familiar sounds of a working farm that had become the soundtrack of their happiness. As summer progressed,
their expanded operation proved even more successful than they had projected, with crop yields that exceeded their most optimistic estimates and livestock that thrived under their careful management. Emma's business training served them well in negotiating favorable contracts with buyers, while Tom's agricultural expertise ensured that their products commanded premium prices for quality and consistency. The success of their enterprise attracted attention throughout the valley, with other farmers seeking advice about new techniques and equipment, while also acknowledging Emma and Tom as leaders in the agricultural community. Emma found particular satisfaction in mentoring other women who wanted to take more active roles in their family farming operations, sharing both practical skills and the confidence that came from proving herself capable of physically demanding work. "You've started something," Tom observed after Emma finished teaching a group of farm wives how to keep accurate financial records for their operations. "These women are going to transform how farming gets done in this valley." Emma smiled, recognizing that her own transformation from dependent stepdaughter to independent businesswoman had indeed created a model that other women could follow. "Good. There's no reason farming should be limited to what men can accomplish alone when women can contribute so much." As autumn approached and they prepared for their second harvest as a married couple, Emma reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from desperate flight to prosperous partnership. The woman who had collapsed on Tom's trail had been running from a life that offered no real choices, but the woman she had become was actively building a future that reflected her own values and ambitions. The harvest that year was their largest and most profitable yet, requiring them to hire additional help from town to handle the volume of crops and livestock ready for market. Emma coordinated the logistics with the same efficiency she had once applied to her stepfather's household management, but now with the satisfaction of seeing her efforts directly benefit her own family rather than supporting someone else's lifestyle. "We did it," Tom said on the last day of harvest, surveying fields that had been completely cleared and barns that were filled to capacity with the fruits of their labor. "We actually did it." Emma nodded, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from achieving goals that had seemed almost impossibly ambitious when they first made their plans. But more than the financial success or the agricultural achievement, she was proud of what they had built together as partners and equals. That evening, as they shared a celebratory dinner in their candle-lit cabin, Emma raised her glass in a toast that captured the essence of their remarkable journey together. "To working in each other's fields," she said, her eyes meeting Tom's across the table, "and sleeping safely in each other's arms." Tom's answering smile conveyed all the love and contentment that had grown from that desperate night when he had offered shelter to a starving woman and discovered instead the partner who would help him build a life worth celebrating. Outside their window, the Colorado mountains stood sentinel over the valley they had made their own, protecting the love story that had begun with an offer of work and safety and had grown into something that would endure as long as the peaks themselves. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.